The Innovating for Money and Audiences discussion features Paul Wiegard, Jas McSweeney, Dr. David Court, and moderator Rosie Hole. It was recorded live at the 2025 Spada Conference.
Tēnā koutou katoa, kia ora, my name's Rosie. Welcome to this panel on Innovating for Money and Audiences. Before I introduce our panellists today, I thought it could be helpful to start with a snapshot of how New Zealand films have been performing over the last 10 years. So this slide shows our New Zealand films against the total New Zealand box office. The line in blue is the percentage of New Zealand films as a percentage of the total releases in New Zealand. And the line in green is our share of box office. So there's a few points on this timeline that I think are worth focusing on. So in 2021, no surprises, we had COVID, and you can see that New Zealand films took a much greater share of the market. Of course, we know that studios were holding back their releases, and so our local films were competing against a much smaller pool of big global blockbusters. Generally, though, across the 10-year period, we seem to be hovering somewhere between 3 to 4% share of number of releases and around 2 to 3% share of total box office. That is except for either ends of the graph when there's something interesting that happens. So in 2015-16 and 24-25, you can see that New Zealand films take a larger share of the total box office compared to our number of releases. What's that about? So the answer is 2 extraordinary New Zealand films whose performance blows everything else out of the water. Those films are, of course, Hunt for the Wilder People and Tina. And you can see when I take them out of the data just how much that skews the result. And then if we look at Tina in particular against the films it was up against over the past year, you can see how exceptional that performance was. And it's clear that this kind of performance is unusual. If we look at our top 10 New Zealand films in the past 5 years, in that post-COVID era, Tina is the only film to break 2 million. And actually the last 4 on that chart don't even get to 1 million. So the question is, how do we get more Tinas, more Hunt for the Wilder Peoples, films that really connect with our audiences? And coupled with that, how do we finance these films at a time when funding levels are static at best and spending from the market is contracting? So joining the panel we have Paul Wiegard, who should be pretty happy because he released both of those films, co-founder and CEO of Madman Entertainment, Jas McSweeney, who leads local and international acquisitions for Umbrella, and of course known to many here previously as head of marketing at Te Tumu Whakata Taonga, the New Zealand Film Commission, and David Court, who is the founder of Compton School and co-founder of Wiser. He's the chair of Screen Canberra, and previously the head of screen business at AFTRS, the Australian Film, Television and Radio School in Sydney. And I wanted to open this discussion with what...
And there is a new entrant, Pike River.
Of course,
which is
Pike River is outside of this data set, just to be clear. Just to be clear.
We're moving with the time. So there's a new entrant in that top 5. So
yeah, no, fantastic. Woo. So I'm going to open with a question. Making films for an audience, it sounds really obvious and like what we're all trying to do, and straightforward. And why is it not in practice? I don't know if you'd like to kick that off, Paul.
That we're not making films for audiences?
Or that we're not making films that get that kind of connection like those 2 films have.
I mean, it's always about, I guess, a portfolio, right? So not all films are, what are the objectives of the films? Not all films are going to appeal to all quadrants, for example. And it's fine. I think the ratio of performance is good if you compare it to many other territories around the world and in the US. Hopefully I'm not debunking all your thesis here. But, compared to Australian cinema, for example, which is where I'm based, but we have a couple of my Kiwi colleagues are in the audience here. I think the Australian films are battling even more so than the NZ films. We'd probably, like for like, are probably at about 60% of those levels. So at most, I didn't quite get the volume of films versus the share of box office, but say it's a similar number, 30 to 40 films a year being made, and the Australian films are they're probably struggling to be at 2% of the gross box office. And to not have a film in Oz that's achieving at least 20 million at the box office, it's like there's something amiss there. At least we're seeing that when we have films that do appeal to audiences, New Zealand audiences, there's seemingly very little in the way of cultural cringe. They want to support local stories and proud to see their stories on screen. I'd almost say that one of the bedeviling natures of the New Zealand market is because the population is relatively small, the ability to make a whole lot of films, and enough films, is part of the challenge. It's a bit like, think about it as a pyramid. The bigger the base, the higher the peak. And I would almost argue, we're not making enough films in this marketplace. That has a whole other series of things that sort of run off that. In terms of if you're making more films and you're in practice, you're better at your craft, and you're more likely to sort of craft stories that are going to be largely better told. So for mine, I don't think it's broke. In terms of the audiences do have a demand for the local films. The challenge is obviously the financing part of it. There aren't clearly enough doors to knock on in this territory. So I guess the biggest challenge, how do you make very specific local stories for the primary audience, which is the New Zealand audience, and also attract international money to help fund these films to be made in the first instance? I think that's the issue that we need to sort of try and problem solve. And I won't speak for 60 minutes and block my colleagues out here, but the one of the things from a Madman perspective, when we're looking at any New Zealand film, it's like one of our ambitions is for every one of these films, including Tina and Hunt for the Wilder People, the performance in the Australian market should equal, in terms of just revenue, that of the NZ marketplace, and which has proven to be the case, and hopefully will be the case for Pike River when it's released next Easter.
What was the question again?
I guess why are we not making more of those kind of films like Tina?
I think we're making films for an audience. I think that we aren't making more of those films, and I think that that's probably because most of our funding, the majority of our funding comes from the New Zealand Film Commission, and that's a cultural agency. So I think that when writers or producers develop a project, they're not thinking about the audience first. They're thinking about the cultural and the creative elements of that and the plot and the structure of how that was going to fit. So I think that we know, so the films that are very successful that you brought out were films like Hunt for the Wilder People, also Boy, as well as Tina, and Pike River. Those films knew their audience, and they knew what they were, and they knew what they were going to try, what they were trying to say from the screen to the seat in the cinema. So yeah.
And do you think that, did you have something to add? No. Do you think that we're doing enough to foster and develop our local audiences? I noticed that recently the UK, I think it's the Culture, Media and Sport Committee, recommended that the UK tax credit be extended to cover P&A. And so as part of the problem that we're spending a lot of money making the films, but maybe not getting them to the audience.
Yeah, I think we need to spend more time learning about audience and understanding what audience are doing and how they're consuming, what the conversations that they're having, the pressures and the challenges, and respond to that. Because if you don't understand who your audience is, and if you don't understand what moves them, and what they care about, they're never going to be able to connect with your story. Do you agree?
Yes. It's funny, like I think about the Brits. The Brits are incredible when it comes to exporting their storytelling. And I don't know whether it's like a a way of just, and in doing so, they attract a lot of international investment into their projects. It's funny, from an Australian's perspective, looking at the NZ market, it's actually relatively inexpensive here to connect with audiences. The cost of media in NZ is far less than what it is in Oz. So the ability to actually have deep reach and a number of impressions in the local marketplace are there. So I don't think that's as much of a hurdle. It's just, I don't know whether we're making enough films, frankly. I mean, it's, and of course, you know, we're in the southern hemisphere here, and so much of our media and all the stuff which we were listening in the last panel, so much that's being generated internationally, and it's so noisy with so much information coming into our various screens. It is overwhelming. I mean, one of those sort of stats which you didn't quite have in your first couple of slides there. You know, if you went back 10, 15 years ago, there'd be 300 films a year. And again, we're always talking about feature films here and feature documentaries. There'd be 300 films a year hitting our screens. Now, in terms of all the various, because of the digital projection, across all of our different formats, there's up to 1,000 titles a year that are new, that are hitting our screens. So it's even a lot more competition just in terms of what's hitting the marketplace. And on top of that, in a repertory sense, films that are coming back for that are restored, or live events, or other things that are hitting our screens from yesteryear, there's another 2,000 titles. So over the course of the year, there's 3,000 different types of films that are programmed for our box office. So it's just noisy out there. But I would say, and one of the things which has been great with working with the New Zealand Film Commission is they're very supportive of local, supporting local productions into release, and I guess they consider it an insurance play on their investment into the productions in the first instance, isn't it? It's one thing, investing into your local films, but if you're not also investing into the release of them, then I guess it's a bit of a misstep. But there are mechanisms in place which are good. And I actually constantly say to Screen Oz, you should take the example from NZ. So pat on the back to the Kiwis. That fell on deaf ears. I think it's doing.
Yeah, let's get a round of applause for that.
But generally, like something like Pike River, just to see that ongoing concern and leading into it, I think it works for the producers and it works for everyone involved.
Jas, you were talking about the two films we mentioned and others that have been successful and that they really knew their audience. What does it look like when you put audience at the centre of the film from the very beginning? I guess from your experience as distributors and maybe your previous experience, how can you tell that that's what a producer or what a team is doing and that they've got it right?
Well, when you have a project and you recognise who the audience is right from the very beginning, from the script stage, then you can start working with the producer on how you create the content, how you find the audience. So the audience is always part of the conversation when you're having the marketing conversations. What does the poster look like? What's the trailer going to look like? How are we going to create those content? Where are they? What do we need to have while we're in production, etc., etc. It just makes it much more easier. I know you did that for Hunt for the Wilder People. You banked so much content, which you probably haven't used all of it, Paul, but you can create a wealth of material.
And a certain filmmaker who really had a specific idea of what he wanted.
Yeah.
And it's funny, it's not always...
And not just the director, also the producer was there, and the producer was driving those creative choices and contributing ideas, phoning me up. I was at the Film Commission at the time, phoning me up and saying he had done research, and this is where this community of people lived who he thought that would connect to. Even overseas, he would say, in the States, there's loads of people who are from New Zealand in the state because blah, blah, blah. So really getting into the middle of how we're going to find the audience and how we're going to capture them.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the criteria for us investing into films is the creative team representative of the audience? Are they the audience, and do they genuinely, deeply know and embody the themes of the project that they are working on? And with that, you're 2/3 of the way there, I think. Now then becomes obviously the job of executing on that idea.
And I love that idea that, you know, your producer is kind of talking to you about where they think the market might be. How do you think producers should take more responsibility for finding their audience and for marketing to them? And how do they do that alongside you as a distributor?
Yes, I do think the producer should take more responsibility. You don't just drop the film off and leave it with us. They definitely need to understand who the audience is for the film they're making and where they are. How can they contribute to that? The Film Commission has just introduced a new producer impact fund, and that's something that the producer has to apply for, but they work in tandem with the distributor on how that fund is used. So it's sitting down, and we've been having conversations. We are going to try and access it for a film that we're going to distribute. But so we've been sitting down and having conversations with the producer and the director around who do we think the audience is, what does that look like, what are those knowledge gaps that we need to plug, and where can we enhance our knowledge, and where can we spread our reach, and that we can use it in a way which is efficient, fast, and going to be effective and not too time consuming, because sometimes people have fantastic ideas, but it's just a fantastic idea.
Yeah, man, there can be a lot of time to sit around there talking about doing stuff without doing things. So it's very important to put a line down the ledger and go, on this side, these are the responsibilities of the producing team. These are the list of things that the distributor will do. But I think it's amazing what a producer and creative team can do and contribute to the release and the rollout of a project. You know, it's the simplest one is just, frankly, talent wrangling and working with talent and all of the idiosyncrasy, intricacies with just that, and I guess the counselling that goes with it as well. But every one of these films would not be the success that they have been if it didn't have the involvement of the local producing teams.
But there does come a point where the producer has to say to the distributor, I've done my job, now you do your job and you release. Because sometimes if you have those two, it can become quite tense and incredibly stressful, and the film and the release of the film will suffer.
Mm. So I wanted to ask a question that sort of taps into a debate that comes up every so often, I think everywhere that has a public funding system, and certainly I've sort of seen chatter about it recently with the BFI. Should funding agencies support commercial films regardless of their cultural value, or do you think they should find their own way?
Commercial films can have cultural value as well.
No, yeah, exactly.
Yes, I agree. Yes, they should, and I think I think they want to. I think funding agencies in 2025, my experience anyway, is that they want to reach audiences. The days where you would make a film for 3 people, and I'm one of those 3 people that love those arty films, are gone. You know, you want. Going to a cinema and watching a film together, especially a film which is centred on people who live in your community and your country, is an incredible way to be a community and to have a challenge and to have a conversation about how other things how things are affecting people that may not be in your immediate sphere.
Yes. But, you know, I mean, it's a portfolio, so it's just a mix. You can't, in everything in life, particularly the role of the funding bodies is to manage a portfolio of interests. So just, you know, what's that bandwidth between the level of investment? And I would say that there's so much public money going into production, attraction, incentives. I'm not too sure what the language here is, just to incentivise productions to be shot in NZ, so it is happening, but through a different strand. So yes, you know, I mean, it's interesting now. You probably the question then to ask is, what is a New Zealand story or a local story? Is it a South Island story? Is it a North Island story? Is it a and just what is that cultural remit now? Is it the same as what it was 10 years ago? I know certainly in the Australian marketplace, it's very much there is a changing face of the composition of the population, so that needs to be represented on our screens as well.
I'd say yes, and there's a reason why, which is that, we operate with a social licence, which justifies the public subsidy that occurs. And I'm thinking here more about Australia, where we are bumping along at a couple of % share of the box office, and it's hard to see how that really pays a dividend to Australian taxpayers. And I think, what's giving us cover in Australia is the fact that so many Australian actors, appear in international films, and that creates the social goodwill for the industry. But if you took away that cover, I think the 2% bump is really not enough to maintain over time the public commitment to filmmaking.
So I wanted to touch on some of the things that came up in the previous session with Frances Valentine. She presented a number of AI tools that are now available to us as an industry. Do you think that, I guess from your corner of the industry, are there tools out there that could help us better identify audiences, better deliver to audiences throughout the process, I guess from the very beginning?
Oh, we're already using it. I mean, it's almost implicit within every single marketing channel that we're using through social, that there's AI tools there that are identifying certain groups, and then the messaging is becoming even more personalised. I wouldn't say there's one specific tool. It's funny, in the world of distribution, so much of what we bring to the table is almost like operational excellence. So the tools are being used across legals. A lot of it's around analysis. A lot of it's around. So we use lots of big data sets. One of the big mandates of at least the Madman business over the last 20 years is sort of developing our B2C interests, is in that direct communication with audiences, so we can have that direct dialogue, and that can be through literal old-fashioned mailing lists and EDM lists, through to just the following groups that we have across the YouTube channels, and now we have our own sort of streaming platform, DocPlay, which is specialising in feature documentaries and docuseries from around the world, and that's been amazing for those in the feature documentary space. We talk to about 130,000 people across Australia and New Zealand twice a week, and these are people who have declared their interest in documentaries and local stories, because 35% of that content on that platform is Australian or New Zealand. So it's in everything we're doing in one way or another now. So if it means it helps fast track, we often use it in a marketing sense as well. We're just sort of fast tracking think tank ideas. But my concern is, with all these sorts of things, how much of it is just looking in a rear view mirror? And the one thing in distribution is, in creative ideas, you can't be following the trend. You end up being sort of lost in the backwash of it all. So, I don't like the idea of the lazy default. We can't have a thought of our own, and we have to run through an AI tool before we do anything. So there's a real need to saying, okay, well, why is this of interest, and what are the human insights? But there's so many other things that can get us to the point where we can have those deeper conversations, because we've got a lot of that sort of grunt work may have been done.
Jas, are you using any tools?
To speed up research, like Paul says, if you know that you're trying to find a community and where their population is, we'll use it. But mostly I use AI to listen to social media, so I have it set up so the AI knows that I'm listening to certain people, and every morning they report to me and tell me who's been saying what about what. Yeah.
Just to be slightly contrary, I think lots of the information we need about audiences, all the data, the insight, is actually sitting in about 100 silos out here. And our problem is, how do we centralise, how do we share, how do we make the most of what we already have, in terms of understanding what audiences want, where they're going, how we can keep up, all those sorts of questions. I think it's gathering together, collectivising, if you like, the distributed insights of in particular the producing community.
So this panel's about innovating for money and audiences. So looking at how we take that and look at it, opening up other sources of capital for our films. With the success of films like Tina, do you think we should be doing more to promote private investment in films? And do you think that the success of Tina sort of makes that conversation with investors a bit easier?
We're gamblers, so we only talk about the wins. So I guess we do that. It's interesting. It's the biggest unlock, hopefully, for going into production is attracting private interest, other sources of revenue, not just coming out of a couple of commissioning pots. The more private money that you can pull into the system, into the ecosystem, means it's more likely that you're going to control the intellectual property ongoing for a longer period of time. So the studios don't go down this path because they need to own rights outright, and it's more of a commission, so the checks are larger up front, and then it's, thanks for that, goodbye. And there are some residuals, obviously, that get negotiated, but for the producing pool in Australia and New Zealand, the more that they can own their own intellectual property and have control on it, and frankly, are empowered because they're bringing in third parties, the better. So we struck arrangements with both with Wilder People producers and Tina, that they were participating from $1. So there's an alignment of interests. Is it enough to attract significant sums? Well, it's a high-risk enterprise. So you've got to sit down there, I think fundamentally, sit down there with whoever the potential parties are that you're attracting into a project and go, what are the objectives here? If it's just purely a financial investment and you're stacking it up against, investing into residential property, well, maybe it's not for you. Huh?
AI.
Or AI. Well, it is going to be a bust. When? Who knows, just let's go back and look at 1929 and, it's going to come, but just when? And that was last session. So, the most productive and busiest producing teams that we see have a cohort of private investors that support their vision, and they basically reinvest. So they've had that experience, and then they return and they reinvest into the next project, following the next project. So bring it on. I think it's a tough discussion to have and how to make it work, but if we can solve, and I think that's what's needed, and it means it's more of an industry, frankly. In the US, it's clearly an industry for a lot of, but then there's that wild card of the US. You got that the land of the billionaires, right? So you get all these sort of false economies happening in the same breath. So for this territory, it's vital, and I can't think of a major Australian or New Zealand film that we've been involved with in the last 5 years that didn't have a significant amount of private investment.
I can put some Australian numbers around this. There's currently typically in Australia, there's about $20 million of private investment in films each year, and that's typically about 5% of the total, which I think is a very low number. I don't know what the comparable numbers are here in Aotearoa, but I imagine they're comparable, similar. And, on the converse, I would say that if you look historically to see which have been the most successful films, in almost every case there is that alignment of producer with distributor and investor. And it's the three together, the three, drivers, the trifecta of producer, distributor and investor that have driven the big films, the big successful commercial films.
So beyond that, like having a great sort of investor relationship that continues, and Paul said it's a risky business. Given the checkered history of private investment in films, what do you think, David, it would take to build an investment market for New Zealand films? Is there more of a portfolio approach that we need to look at?
Certainly there would have to be a will to do it to start with, but I think there's some simple things we can do, or relatively, when I say simple, they're not that simple, but you know, from an investment perspective, clearly one would wish to be offered as an investor a portfolio of opportunities rather than single opportunities. This is, as Paul says, a high risk sector, and the highest risk way to go about that is to invest in just one film. So a portfolio, I think, is fundamental to attracting any kind of organised professional capital to the sector. And second, we typically drop investors in at the equity level, you know, their first money in, last money out, and that's not a happy place to be most of the time. So I think we need to offer, you know, a range of opportunities to investors, you know, at all levels of the waterfall. So not just equity. But beyond all that, we need to have you know, an attitude to this which is embracing and opening, and we need more transparency, we need more data. I mean, money ultimately is driven by information. And if there's not enough information, then all you can ask for is blind punts, and you won't get much of that.
Do you think our films are right-sized in terms of scale and budget for the size and expectation of our audiences here in New Zealand? I thought what was interesting when I showed the slide with the films that Tina was up against last year, I mean, you're looking at, you know, multi-million blockbusters and this lovely little film that was able to compete regardless of that scale.
It's interesting. I would almost say the budgets aren't big enough in NZ. Like just there's such a humble culture in many ways that the first sort of cut of the budgets are quite a little bit too modest. I almost think like shoot a little larger. Sometimes it's actually easier to fund a bigger budget, interesting enough, because you might have a few more elements in there that do attract private money, and then can be seen, the vision and the opportunity for the project arguably is larger, so it comes with less risk, and that's why, you know, just look at Hollywood, and it's returning IP, and the budgets are huge, and, you know, in many ways it's seemingly in the management of risk, there's less risk that is involved. So for the best part, I would say thereabouts right size. If not, they should be larger. And then when it comes to the feature documentaries, the biggest cost is the human cost and time, and giving your project enough time, because it just requires exactly that. Because most great docs are almost like longitudinal studies, and they are they're better for that time.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that. I mean, the thing is that when we look at the box office figures like we did, we're showing New Zealand films which are kind of on average shot for $6 million against Hollywood or bigger budget films. And so when you look at Tina and Hunt for the Wilder People and Pike River, that shows how amazing those films have done for the budget to reach that thing level. I think, I mean, the more concern for me is the money go round and making sure that the producers who are involved with those films that are finding their audiences at the box office are getting their returns faster, so that they can continue to make more films and to have a pipeline, which is what David is talking about, which will then encourage to have investors who are part of that pipeline and who know, and the producers can have some surety that these films are coming through, and that they know that they can make a film in 2024 and make another film in 2025 and another film in 2026, and that's how their business works, and they can have a workable model that they can be confident in and they can talk to their investors about.
And so we talk about box office a lot because I guess it's the most easily accessible data we have. Do you think that's the most important metric? Should we be looking more about return on investment, some other measure? I mean, you know, the Blumhouse model is make them small and then over-deliver, but...
And make a shit ton of money, yeah. Well, yes, particularly in the feature docs. the objectives are about impact, social change, legacy stories. There's all sorts of motives as to why. It's like I always think most films should be looked at over at least a sort of, not in that first week of box office performance, but over at least a 3 to 5 year timeline to really appreciate whether there's been the level of acceptance in a number of different windows that have been exploited and the different ways it's found audiences. So, and that is back to the point, there is probably not enough pooled data to put it into a coherent sort of case study on each of these performances of the films. So in most cases, when a distributor takes on the rights to represent a film, it's somewhere between 7 and 15 years, depending on the order of investment. And that's for the reason that we see that there's a number of windows that we need to exploit. And it's complicated now with AVOD and premium VOD and EVOD. Look that definition up. That's a new one. All the VODs, and then there's the airlines. So, and then actually for Madman, and particularly in our interest in the feature doc area, to the question of the reach and performance, a lot of it's actually seen in the success within the education systems, in secondary and tertiary, and it is really meaningful in terms of the longevity of these projects.
And do you mean
returns.
meaningful in terms of revenue as well?
As well. And Screenwrights, I think who are represented here today, do a fantastic job in trying to grow that size of the pie for particularly the feature documentary market in terms of its use. And then there's a knock-on impact, and how was that enabled? Well, the right study guides and the way in which that was presented to teachers who were very busy to then take it out into their schools. So yes, there should be multiple ways of looking at projects in terms of the success and the objectives, depending on what the substance of the material is.
Yeah, I agree, because it's all, there are some films that should be made and should be told, and which are not going to the audience, they're not going to achieve the box office, but box office is a measurement and it's really important, and it can drive good ancillary sales, especially in Australia, that they will require to have a authentic theatrical release. And that's important to those buyers. So yeah, it is a measurement, but also, we have some films where we know when we put them into the cinemas that it's probably a 2-week fast turnaround because the audience is at home. Yeah.
So I want to ask a question to each of you, and this is, if you could make one big change to the way the industry works, and I guess in relation to what we're talking about, reaching audiences and attracting investment, what would your big change be?
I'll go first then. The big change I would like to see is for us to embrace as an industry private capital, and the reason for that is that public capital serves policy goals, which is great. That's its job. Private capital is for growth. It's for expansion. It's for risk taking. It's specifically for risk taking and for the sorts of ambition that we should as an industry continue to embrace. So I think if my ideal industry would be one where we attracted maybe 3 or 4 times the 5% of private investment that we're attracting now. So somewhere between 10 and 20% private capital to fund not just the films, but also the production companies where that's appropriate, and to fund film adjacent activities. So other ways of exploiting the same underlying intellectual property, and empowering producers to take that longer run perspective of what they're doing, get more deeply involved in developing and exploiting the intellectual property, and not having to jump film to film to film for the next fee. So I think that's what I think private capital can do for us, but it would take the ambition to achieve that. It would take the will to achieve that, and then the following sort of settings and changes that would need to be made, not just to policy and practice, but as I say, to expectations and belief.
Okay, my big change would be that when a film gets development funding or has development funding applied to it, that at the same time that marketing funding is applied so that marketing research can happen around the audience. And and that's...
Okay, I'll be the uncouth Aussie. It's interesting, the New Zealand on Air contribution is pivotal, and many of these projects would not happen without that support, and it's incredibly important cultural door to have to knock on, and has led to incredibly important and valued works. But it also is inadvertently sort of kneecapping some of the upside for producers downstream, because it's locking up certain rights into a free-to-air sort of investment or like approach, which is you're making these films to be seen, of course, but it just means that you're a bit hamstringed in terms of the level of investment. This is very much from a distributor perspective, where you would like to put more investment into the project, but you've got limited downside because you don't have that potential ancillary sale further down the track. So it might require constitutional or legislative change around that, but there should be a little bit more flexibility. Not to say that's completely stringent in its application, but I think that would potentially, you could potentially find the best of both worlds. But again, I understand why it was established in that way, because it was, okay, we want to make sure that investment in terms of social, capital and what have you, that these projects were being seen, and it was democratised and they were being seen for free. But there can be that step, but at what point in terms of the time life of a project? Thinking that, we think about these projects over multiple years, not just at the box office.
Wonderful.